Hi, my name is Benedict. In this video we're going to be looking at the basics, the essentials of MIDI. Unfortunately, they have to a great extent been lost. MIDI still underpins absolutely everything, but a lot of particularly newcomers, or even people who've been at it for a while, don't really understand the basics of MIDI, which means they're not getting the basics of what they're trying to do and how their DAW thinks. And that becomes problematic for them because they then can't solve the problems that they've kind of created for themselves by going whoop straight over the top of something that's the way things work. Most people now only think of MIDI as in MIDI files, or really lamentably, a MIDI. I downloaded a MIDI. Don't say that, please. It just sounds so dumb. MIDI files are the first thing that most people are going to encounter where they're really dealing with the word MIDI. The other term, of course, is it sounds like MIDI or MIDI sound, which is, of course, absurd because MIDI is only a set of instructions. It was a thing that had been developed for some time, was formalized in the early 80s as a way for one synthesizer to talk to or control another. So we could have one keyboard playing a keyboard over there, which made it far more convenient, like on stage, where you could have one keyboard and play selectively a bank of synthesizers somewhere else, just as a drum set with a set of heads, like the octapads, could control a synthesizer, a brain sitting somewhere else. That control was done with MIDI. The other use for MIDI on stage, which is still very much, as far as I'm aware, current to today, is for lighting controllers controlling lights, which you will understand a little bit as we go if you stay with this. The MIDI file most people see as a way of downloading a song. Hotel California, we can download that, put that into our DAW of choice, and suddenly we hear Hotel California coming out of our speakers, but it doesn't sound like the Eagles. It sounds like a bad video game. Because, obviously, we're not hearing the Eagles, we're not duplicating the Eagles. This is not a WAV file or an MP3. This is actually just the note information that somebody, not the Eagles, let me tell you, put into a sequencer. They kept just the raw note on-off data, a few other things, and that's what you get, which then's applied to 57 layers of pianos. So we can take a pre-made song that somebody made, export it as MIDI, so you lose the actual audio information, but you've got just the notes on and off. Now, that was incredibly useful for lots of reasons. One was that you could do backing tracks much easier. They were happening more in real time. The other was that you could send this off to, say, computer games, and the computer game itself could be generating the sound on the fly. So it was far easier where you had an FM sound chip or early sample sound chips on board inside your computer or inside your gaming console. And rather than having this massive amount of audio WAV files, you could simply recreate the performance in real time inside the console. MIDI wasn't designed for that, but it was perfect for that kind of situation because it's a control script for how to control stuff. So it's a way to export and transfer the performance data, but only the performance data. And a lot of people these days struggle with that concept because they go, oh, here's the song that I'm listening to. When I download my MIDI file, it doesn't sound like that. No, because your MIDI file has only exported the control information of the performance. It has not exported the synthesizers at all. Yes, if you happen to own Reason, and I happen to have bundled the presets for these instruments that I have made, yes, you could download my MIDI file, you could download my presets, assign my presets, and it would come out sounding like this, give or take. What is the basic MIDI spec? Before we get into the how it works, we need to understand what MIDI does. We have one cable with an ugly 5-pin DIN on each end, both male plugs, a socket on the back of a synthesizer or on the back of an audio interface is what we plug those into. MIDI is bidirectional, as in it sends to and from, but its plugs on your devices tend to be one way. So you have a MIDI in that will receive information. You have a MIDI out that will send information. If you try and treat a MIDI out like a MIDI in, you will get nothing. There are a few devices which had a MIDI out/through port. So a through port being whatever came into the in port would be echoed through the through port, allowing you to do what's called daisy chaining. Within that cable, that one cable with its ugly 5-pin DIN, you had the ability to send up to 16 channels of MIDI data at once. You see I've got 3 tracks here. That could be thought of as the equivalent of 3 channels. If this was old-fashioned MIDI, this would probably be assigned to MIDI channel 1, MIDI channel 2, MIDI channel 3. So my one MIDI string, my piece of MIDI cable, could send all 3 of these to either one device that was able to receive 3 different instruments at once and play them multi-timbral, or we could send to the first, which would only respond to channel 1, which would daisy out to the second, which would only respond to channel 2, and daisy out to the third, which would only respond to channel 3. And I can hear many of you glazing over, go, what's this got to do with anything? It's the past, it sucks, and you suck, and this, that, and the other, and your shirt's stupid, and okay, well, you are entitled to whatever opinion. I'm, of course, entitled to my opinion that you're going to die with that. So understand the basics of this. You had 16 MIDI channels, which meant you with your one piece of MIDI string, you could control up to 16 instruments, 16 devices. So it could be 4 instruments and 12 IntelliBeams flashing your relax, don't do it lasers. There are then the bits of information that are actually sent across those 16 channels. And remember, all of these can be happening at once, but for sanity's sake, just think of one track, one channel. You could send a patch number. So that would call up a preset in your instrument, assuming your instrument A had presets and B could respond. But we will assume that that is the case. If you have a D50, you can send it patch number 128, and it will call patch 128 to the top to be the instrument that plays. If you call patch number 4, it will swap to patch number 4. It would often take a second or so for that patch to fully instantiate and be ready to play. So it's quite common in a MIDI file that there might be a bars gap, and the very first thing being called was your patch number, a little bit of silence for the computers to get themselves sorted, then you start playing notes. The most important pieces of information there are note on and note off, because if we don't have note on and note off data, how does it know when to go and when to go? So note on and note off, and a lot of people miss that because they don't think logically or like a computer. The computer has to be able to say, when does the note go down, when does the note come up? So note on and note off. In the middle of that note on and off, there is extra data. There will be the note number. Is it that note, or that note, or that note, or that note? And of course it can be doing that very fast with a lot of data. I can't remember the maximum PPQ or data depth for notes, but it was enough for most performances to come across pretty darn well. You can hear here. That sounds pretty smooth. And Reason actually doesn't have the highest PPQ, which is the number of time slices that it's playing. So we've got a note on, a note off, and the note number. So we've switched on a note and it's that note. We've switched off the note and it is that note. If you confuse that data, then you'll get what's called a hung or a stuck note. And normally the exclamation point is the way to kill that in most DAWs. We also have velocity. You can hear where it plays soft. Thank you. We get a quiet note. Harder I play, the more you can hear the keyboard itself, but the louder. And this is really important because that's where the phrasing comes from. We'll play with that a little bit more later. That's velocity. So the velocity as in how fast the key is pressed. Most people think how hard it's pressed, but it's actually how fast that key goes down. So if you learn to have a really light touch, you can actually do that without hammering your keyboard. There's then another class of controllers. There's a few more, but we will just cover the basics here, so we're not going to get into the complex stuff. You've got pitch bend, which is the ability to warp a note. Not used in every situation, but very, very useful for leads, emulating guitars, wacky stuff when you're Gary Newman, or craft work. Pitch bend is a kind of controller. And then we've got controller data, or continuous controllers, or CCs. The most famous of those being the mod wheel, which is not assigned here, but commonly used for assigning something, particularly modulation, like vibrato. So we raise that and suddenly you've got a vibrato happening. You will see that in performances by great synthesists, or even not so great ones. They're using the mod wheel to do this, and they're using the pitch bend wheel to bring in kind of feel. There are an awful lot more controllers. Like everything with MIDI, there are 128 of them. The first one is noted as controller 0 or 00 or 000, and the last one is noted as controller 127. 0 being like the equivalent of 1, and 127 being like the equivalent of, 128. But computers count 0 as a valid position, so it can be offsetting slightly. But mod wheel is the simplest and the easiest, and it outputs data which moves continuously. So often, as doors started to appear, that was assigned to filter cutoffs. We'll look at that in a moment. There are main bits of data which are flying backwards and forwards up and down this MIDI cable. Up the MIDI cable when I'm playing to record something in my sequencer, down the MIDI cable when I'm playing back the sequencer and my keyboard is playing the sounds. Of course, my keyboard is soundless because it's a controller. My synthesizers are inside here, which we're not going to waste time looking at because it's not relevant. Not here. MIDI files are prone to sounding really flat. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that. Often it is because everything's masked in really, really rigidly. Fair enough. But the biggest problem is that invariably there is no sense of performance within that. So what happens these days is that people bypass the concept of MIDI and a performance entirely, and they try to solve every problem with layers of plugins, VST plugins, to make it sound good, which invariably don't make it sound good. They actually kind of make it sound bad, and get into mixing. So if we play our MIDI data here, we can say, okay, great, we've got the piece right, basically, but it sounds a bit... We can pull that string back, and we can decide whether to pull the bass or the piano back. No right answer, it all depends on what the piece is about. This is about nothing, so it's irrelevant. That's one way of doing it, but the problem is we haven't fixed the flat performance. If we look at our electric piano, we can quickly see every note is masked in perfectly, and every note is exactly the same velocity, despite the fact that our instrument can handle velocity differently. In a classic MIDI sequencer, and underneath this concept of a DAW, everything is still a sequencer, and renaming it a DAW to me is never a wise idea. There would commonly be a panel which we could open, and Cubase still has it, Logic probably still has it, but so many other DAWs have kind of dropped it, Reason being one of them, and while that is okay, it stops you from seeing what's really happening as clearly. You could get this list of note events, So the list would have the time something happened, which you see here, the time the note was released, which is the equivalent of length. You could see what note it was, which is our note here. You could see the velocity at which it was played. And that was all our basic performance data. So here we've got a rather flat performance, which is why that keyboard doesn't sound very good. The piano doesn't sound very good because it doesn't reflect what we're trying to do at all. Let's humanize this a little bit. A bit randomly. Can you hear how that's softer now? Not only have we lost some level because that's designed to respond to level, but we've also lost some brightness, so that gets brighter the harder we play it, and not only softer but warmer. So this movement has actually humanized our performance. Do we want that to be as loud, or do we want this to be louder? I think that's actually nicer. While we may think, oh, it's in 4/4, so the main beat's got to be the loudest, that's a mistake. Yes, if we're playing 4 on the floor drums, yes, we probably want to count that as 1, 2, 3, 4, not 1, 2, 3, 4, because that's boring as well. Something that's really boring that shouldn't be boring. 1, 2, 3, 4. But here, we've actually created some syncopation, some grooviness, by changing our velocity. So we've now suddenly got far less need to play with mixery shit, because our performance is massively better. Is it a great performance? No. But we're just looking at how to improve. We're going to get out of this screen entirely. This looks more confusing, but we can choose which data we're looking at. This is our bass line. This is our electric piano. And this is our string. While you might think, but that's confusing, we shouldn't view it this way. Not only can we see the harmony, but this reflects what early sequences look like, and often you couldn't see all the notes at once. Some you could, but they were really, really hard to use. This makes it pretty easy because we can just click on the notes that we want to focus. So I'm going to say, okay, firstly, that string is just too loud. Yes, we could go to the audio mixer and change the level, but we're not going to. We're going to do that old school here. Down here, we've got this pane that allows us to see the velocity, but this one's not set for velocity at all. I know, because I made the sounds on the fly. So we've got to choose another solution, and that could be amp. Here's one I chose earlier. The master level. I can take my master level and simply drag that down. See how we're setting a value here. This little dot is setting a value. And I can read that value up here. Quieter, louder. It's hard to set levels properly in headphones, but we'll say that's okay. So our piece has suddenly become much more listenable because we've changed the performance. Now we could get clever and put in some more points. And I'm going to say another one there and one here. Now you understand the concept of a continuous controller. Now that's just a wee bit heavy-handed. Now, using just MIDI data, we can say, okay, I want to move that point a little bit. Now that's not very nice. Now in pure MIDI terms, there would be a little dot created for all of these points. See how it's painful. Now this has dropped too much level, so we need to be a little bit more sensitive. So you see I'm just using MIDI things rather than so I've created a little dip there just to help flow this through. Is that elegant or excellent? No, I don't think so, but it's illustrative. Often this is shown as a graph. Different ways of viewing things. I actually really like the point level. Now in many sequences, including Reason, this is not necessarily shown inside the MIDI view, but it has to be available because it's part of the MIDI spec. Often it's shown as extra little clips in the sequencer, and it's way easier to work with. And it separates out the automation, the continuous controller data, from the MIDI. But we're going to keep working with a old school MIDI type spec. So we've taken our string and we've improved the performance by lowering the level with which they're hacking at their fiddles, and also providing some dynamics. Get a little quieter there, guys. A little bit louder again. With some continuous controller. So that's one of our issues is solved. The other issue is this bass line is really rigid. Now, I know that this bass sound does not have automation in terms of velocity, so we can't do anything with that. So what could we do? Well, let's find something else. Here's one I prepared earlier. It was just much easier if I chose this earlier. Filter frequency. Now, MIDI itself is not this specific. This is a modification which hides pure MIDI. If this were pure MIDI, actually I should have thought of this before, MIDI at device. If we look here, we will see MIDI controllers. I should have shown this before. My bad, sorry. This is the MIDI spec. So we've got velocity, we can show pitch bend, aftertouch, which is a more complex one. They've extracted the usual suspects of mod wheel, breath controller, expression, sustain pedal, program change, so we can put in that program change to call patch 74 on RD50. That's an internal thing, and then we can call up controllers, MIDI controller 7, some of them preset in most synths, volume pan, and then some of them get a little bit more complex, 74 being cutoff frequency, assuming your synth responds to that. So that's pure MIDI. Sorry, should have shown that before, but good to see. Let's go back into here. So we're just looking at this pure MIDI. We want our bass line to respond to frequency. So I'm going to choose that here. At the moment it's set really low. Let's set that amount here and at the end so we don't end up with lurches. We can then add some points. I'm adding them as single definable points here very deliberately, so you get the concept that if we had a list we would have a single point, but we're seeing this as a line, and in reality it would be inserting something at every single point there. So just between here and here we would have probably hundreds of little data points. This makes it way easier to manage. In the old days you used to have to draw them in by hand like this, and this has actually decreased that amount of data. Otherwise you end up with a huge amount of data, enough data to clog the MIDI pipe. And that's got a little bright, which I anticipated. So now I'm thinking that's really improved our bass sound, our line, because there's movement in it, but it's now just come across as way too loud. We haven't actually made it louder, but the movement has given us the impression that it is louder, in which case we can go to our master level and insert a number here. Yay! Much nicer. Before we've opened a single VST, a single plugin to betterify it. And this is where the lack of understanding of MIDI causes people to have very flat sounding songs, which they then try and solve with more sound goodifiers. And, well, the problem is the song itself is broken. The performance of the song is broken, which is why you listen to so much modern stuff, and in a time slice it's like sounds amazeballs, but when you sit there and actually listen to it, it sounds like, well, the equivalent of white lino. It's so vanilla, but not in a good way. It's not yummy vanilla. It's just no one could be bothered to enjoy making this. Therefore, no one can be allowed to enjoy listening to it. So that will sound problematic. People will feel like, oh, this isn't blamming enough. So they will start throwing more VST and problems at it to try and solve the fundamental problem, which is they haven't understood how the MIDI spec works and haven't boiled in a performance. And as you see, the performance that I've boiled in here is not exactly stellar. But the difference, and I probably should have done an A-B, but the difference between, and I've done it many, many other times, between the flat, what people will call MIDI sound, as in it lacks any performance, any sense of movement, and now is really notable. Now that is worth mixing, whereas what was there before at the beginning where we had none of this data happening is not going to be fixable in any other way. So understanding MIDI not only makes it much easier to take in a MIDI file and know how to handle it. Part of this was raised because, and I'll answer your question directly here, a fellow, a Logic group, was saying that he was bringing in MIDI files and some of them he couldn't set the volumes properly. He wasn't articulating how he was setting his idea of levels, so I'm thinking he was using MIDI volume, possibly just using the volume of the instrument. So that's like grabbing, and I wasn't going to show this, but that's like grabbing the volume knob here and saying, oh, I'll change that. See here, you can see that's automated. So if I say, oh, I'm going to reset that, because now, oh, let's say this is the volume that I wanted to play back at, you see that as soon as we start playing, MIDI has sent a level, and so it has reset this. I can say, no, that's not the volume I want it to be this. But as soon as we start playing again, curse you! It's because we've got those MIDI events hiding in here. See? Our master level, which is our knob, has got a controller telling it what to do. You can see it moving. Woohoo! So by not understanding the MIDI spec, he's taken in this MIDI file, and of course it's not working because the modern DAW has hidden so much of the way MIDI works, and in certain ways that's really good. It's so much easier, so much more elegant. That's probably the cause of your problem, Mr. Man with Logic and bringing in MIDI files. Has nothing to do with whether they were made in Cakewalk or Cubase or Pro Tools or whatever. It's just to do with not understanding that you've got this extra data sitting here that you're not extracting. Now, if I decided I didn't like this data at all, I could open up my sequencer, select all of that, go, nah, you suck, and then replace it with my own, because this is going to be way better because I did it. Okay, fair enough, but if we don't know it's there, we can't grab it, we can't control it and do anything with it. So, fella, that's your actual issue. That's basically it. There's a lot to cover here. You've got to really think your way through it because it's not the way we're encouraged to think in a modern DAW. But once you get that concept, especially if you look at some pictures of older sequences where they have a note list or an edit window, which is quite literally just seeing like a tracker, where you see this list of data. Often you've got to narrow down and filter it, otherwise what you see is just unintelligible and your head will explode. Then you start to make sense of, oh, this is why we now see things in piano rolls and these little graphic representations of the movement of our continuous controllers. If you have questions, pop them down below.